Hi, my name is Joel Schofield, and I have the privilege of sharing about the life of Jim Elliot, who once penned these words. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And the words are taken from Elliot's notebook that he wrote while he was a senior at Wheaton College. And it was written at a time when the America was booming. They had just gotten out of World War II, and so the idea of the American dream was a prevalent one. And so if you were a college student at that time, the idea was all you had to do was to reach out and receive this American dream. And so instead of pursuing that dream, Elliot chose to do the hard thing and to go to the hard place. And ultimately, it cost him his life. And so what I'm going to do is just to give a brief overview of Elliot's life so that you can get a sense of how God used him to further his kingdom for his glory. So Elliot was born in 1927 in Portland, Oregon, and he had a very common white middle-class upbringing. He was one of four kids, and his parents were faithful, Bible-believing, gospel-believing Christians. In fact, his dad, Fred, was part of the Plymouth Brethren movement, and so he was an itinerant preacher. And so Jim, his son, would join him along on some of his preaching trips. And so at a very young age, God saved Jim and through Jim placing his faith in Jesus Christ for his salvation. And so even as a high school student, Jim sought to be faithful with the message of Christianity. And so, for example, he would share the gospel with peers. He would pray before meals as a visible sign of his faith in God. And even though he was a successful student at Benson Polytech High School, where he was successful at architectural drawings, he, at a pretty early age, felt a sense that God might be calling him to the missions field. And so in 1945, he went on to Wheaton College. And pretty early on in his studies at Wheaton College, he became frustrated because he recognized that studies take a lot of time. And he was frustrated because it took away from his time to study the Bible and prepare for missions. And so thankfully he did have people surrounding him. For example, his dad encouraged him to say, look, God's calling you to study right now. And so finish this call to study, finish your school. And aside from doing school, he didn't spend much time in extracurriculars because he didn't want to get distracted. So he would only do things that would help sharpen him for the missions field. And so, for example, he did wrestling because it would tone his body and prepare his body to do something hard out in the world. Following Wheaton, it should be noted that there was a period of about 3 years where Jim really didn't know exactly where God was going to have him on the missions field. And so, for example, his home church, people were starting to wonder, what's Jim doing? Why is he home for this long? He doesn't have a path. And so, for those of you, I hope you take those of you who are potentially pursuing missions, I hope you take this as an encouragement, because sometimes we don't know how God will pull all the details of his plan for us together. And Elliot's an example of this. And so for Elliot, it took almost 3 years for him to become fully clear where God was going to have him. And ultimately, Elliot ended up in 1952 moving to Ecuador. And he aligned himself with a group called the Missionary Aviation Fellowship. And during this time of the 1950s, it was a time where missionaries were first really starting to use airplanes to seek to reach hard-to-reach peoples. And Elliot really wanted to bring the gospel to people who had never heard about the hope in Jesus before. And so there was a group of people called the Aka people, And this was really a derogatory term, which Elliot didn't know at the time, but it was a term that meant savage. And so, really, what the people were called, they called themselves the Warwani. So I'm going to call them the Warwani. But essentially, these were people who were known to be violent. And Jim wanted to bring the gospel to these people. And so they were hard to find. And over 4 years, it took Elliot 4 years, and there were 5 other missionaries with him, including a pilot named Nate Saint. And so it took them really 4 years to find these people, but eventually they did. And when they initially tried to make contacts, they would fly over the village and basically give gifts. And they did this for 13 weeks until they finally landed near the village, near a river, and they sought to make contact with these people. And ultimately, what it ended in is these people killed them. They speared them before they were able to bring the gospel to them. And so this set off national news in America. But ultimately, God used their deaths to further his kingdom, because Jim's wife, who he married a few years earlier, named Elizabeth, ended up going and living amongst the Warani and bringing the gospel to him, among other missionaries. And so Jim encouraged a missionary movement for those willing to set aside the things of this world for the sake of Christ. And I hope that this overview is helpful for you as you consider the life of Jim Elliot.